He spent most of his life mocking Islam. For him, it was a subject of jokes, debates, and dismissive remarks. He believed he knew enough to laugh, enough to judge, enough to confidently reject it, without ever truly understanding it. The idea of Islam being a religion of peace seemed ridiculous to him. The only version he knew was the one portrayed in headlines and filtered through years of prejudice. He saw Muslims as rigid, angry, and blindly devoted to something he thought made no sense. And with every insult, every joke, every sarcastic comment, he felt more certain that he was right. But life has a way of humbling even the most confident voices. One day, during an open discussion event, he stood up and did what he always did. He mocked. With all the sarcasm he could muster, he criticized the beliefs of Muslims, the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Quran. His voice was loud, his confidence unshakable, and many in the room fell silent. All except for one person, an old Muslim man sitting quietly at the front. The man didn't interrupt, he didn't argue, he didn't even frown. He simply looked at him with calm eyes, full of something the speaker couldn't quite understand. Patience, wisdom, maybe even mercy. And when the man was asked to respond, he didn't. He just smiled softly, looked down, and remained silent. No rebuttal, no defense, just silence. That moment hit harder than any argument. It unsettled him. He had expected a fight, a clash of words, something he could tear apart, but instead he was faced with something far more powerful: stillness. It was as if that silence held a mirror up to his soul. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel victorious after mocking Islam. He felt empty. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that old man. Who was he? What kind of faith gives someone the strength to respond to insult with peace? What truth could make someone so unshaken in the face of mockery? These questions led him on a journey he never expected to take. He began to read, to explore, to listen, not to respond or argue, but to understand. And what he found shook him. The Quran didn't sound like a book of hate. It spoke of mercy, justice, kindness, and deep belief in one God. The Prophet Muhammad wasn't the man he had imagined. He was a man of compassion, humility, and patience, someone who returned hatred with forgiveness. The more he learned, the more he realized that the Islam he mocked never existed. It was a version created by fear and ignorance. And all it took to begin that transformation was one old man's silence. A silence that spoke louder than any words. A silence that planted the first seed of truth in a heart that had been closed for years. He had spent years crafting the perfect arguments against Islam, online debates, public discussions, sarcastic tweets. He was relentless. He saw Islam as backward, oppressive, and incompatible with the modern world. He prided himself on his logic and reason, believing he was helping others see the truth by mocking what he thought were irrational beliefs. Every time he encountered a Muslim, he expected defensiveness, anger, or awkward silence, and often that's exactly what he got. It only reinforced his belief that Muslims couldn't stand up to real criticism, that their faith was built on emotion, not reason, that they were all the same. Then came the day that would slowly begin to undo everything. He attended a community forum where people of different backgrounds were invited to speak about faith and identity. He didn't go to listen, he went to challenge. When the microphone was handed to him, he unleashed a familiar stream of attacks. He questioned the Prophet's character, mocked the Quran, and portrayed Islam as violent and irrational. His tone was sharp, his words confident, and he expected resistance. But there, sitting calmly in the front row, was an old Muslim man. He had a gentle face, white beard, and hands folded in his lap. As the room grew tense and quiet, all eyes turned to him, expecting a reply. But the man didn't say a word. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't even look offended. He just smiled slightly and lowered his gaze, remaining completely still. That silence was deafening. It confused him. Where was the rebuttal, the outrage, the passionate defense? Instead, he was left standing there, full of words, while the man sat in complete peace. And for some reason, that shook him. He left the event that night feeling strange, almost disturbed. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The old man's silence haunted him more than any debate ever had. For the first time, he began to doubt, not Islam, but himself. Why hadn't that man reacted? What kind of strength did it take to stay silent in the face of mockery? Was it weakness, or was it something deeper, something stronger? He didn't have the answers yet, but something inside him had shifted. That silence had pierced through his pride, and in the quiet space it left behind, a question had started to grow. What if I've been wrong all this time? He couldn't get the old man's silence out of his mind. Days passed, but that peaceful expression, that calm gaze, and that total absence of anger stayed with him. He had always believed that silence was weakness, that if someone couldn't defend their faith, it meant they had no answer. But this silence had felt different. It hadn't come from fear. It had come from strength. It had felt like the old man knew something he didn't, something deeper than words. For the first time in his life, he was unsettled not by what someone said, but by what they didn't. That experience forced him to look inward. He realized how much of his worldview had been built on assumptions formed by headlines, hearsay, and harsh online voices. He had never really met Muslims who lived out their faith with grace. All he had ever done was attack a version of Islam he thought was real. But what if that version wasn't accurate? What if he had been mocking something he never truly understood? Driven by a strange mix of curiosity and restlessness, he began to explore Islam, not to tear it down, but to understand it. He started reading translations of the Quran. He watched videos of scholars explaining the faith in calm, respectful tones. He listened to Muslims sharing their experiences and why they chose to believe. And what surprised him most was not what he disagreed with, but what he connected with. He read verses about justice, mercy, caring for the poor, and worshiping the one God. He saw teachings that mirrored values he already held: kindness to parents, honesty in business, compassion toward neighbors. It was nothing like the version he had mocked for years. Slowly, piece by piece, the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. He remembered something else that struck him. The Prophet Muhammad had often responded to insults with patience and forgiveness. The stories of him staying calm when others were cruel now made perfect sense in light of the old man's silence. That man hadn't been silent because he was weak. He was silent because he was following a sunnah, a tradition rooted in dignity and peace. And now, for the first time, he didn't feel like mocking anymore. He felt like listening. The more he listened, the more he realized how much he had missed. Every page of the Quran brought new questions, not of doubt, but of reflection. Why did he never know that Islam held Jesus in such high regard? Why did no one tell him that the Quran commanded Muslims to be just, even to those who wronged them? Why had he never heard of the Prophet's mercy to enemies, his tears and prayer, his care for orphans and the poor? These were not the traits of someone promoting violence or hatred. These were the traits of a man who embodied peace. And that's when it hit him. The old man's silence wasn't a strategy. It was a reflection of faith. That unshakable calm didn't come from indifference. It came from trust in Allah, A trust so deep it didn't need to argue, it didn't need to prove itself, it simply was. That kind of peace, he realized, couldn't be faked. It was the kind of peace that comes from being aligned with truth. He found himself watching videos late into the night, debates, lectures, stories of converts, documentaries about Islam's impact on the world. But the ones that moved him most were the personal stories. Former atheists, Christians, Jews, agnostics, all sharing how they found light in Islam. They didn't all enter through debate. Many, like him, were broken open by a moment of silence, a small act of kindness, a look, a word, or no word at all. It was humbling. He began to meet Muslims in real life, not as opponents, but as human beings. He visited a mosque for the first time, nervous but curious. The people he once feared offered him tea, greeted him with smiles, and answered his questions with incredible patience. They didn't try to convert him. They didn't rush him. They simply lived their faith. And it spoke louder than any words. It was strange, almost ironic. After all the noise he had made mocking Islam, it was silence that brought him here. Not just the old man's silence, but the silence that had started to grow in his own heart. A silence no longer filled with hate, but with awe, humility, and a desire to know more. For the first time, he wasn't talking, he was listening, and it was changing everything. His transformation wasn't instant, it was slow, subtle, and deeply personal. Every day brought a new realization, a deeper understanding, and a humbling awareness of how little he once knew. The arrogance that once fueled his mockery was slowly replaced by gratitude. Gratitude for the people who showed him Islam, not through argument, but through character. Gratitude for the silence that made space for reflection, and most of all, gratitude for the old man whose quiet dignity opened the door to truth. He started spending time with a Muslim family he met at a local interfaith event. They didn't know his past, and he didn't feel ready to share it, but their warmth was undeniable. They invited him into their home without hesitation, fed him home-cooked meals, and treated him like one of their own. He watched how they prayed together, how they spoke gently to their children, how they treated each other with respect. It was all so natural, so sincere. There was no show, only peace. One evening, he asked the father of the family why they were so kind to someone who wasn't Muslim. The man smiled and said, "Because our prophet taught us that every human being deserves kindness, regardless of faith." That simple answer left him speechless. It wasn't about winning someone over. It was about living with compassion, regardless of the outcome. He thought back to his old self, the version of him that would have laughed at such an answer. He used to believe that faith made people weak and irrational. But now he saw the strength it took to stay kind in a harsh world. He saw how much control and discipline it took to live according to principles when everything around you pushes the opposite. He saw Islam not as a religion of control, but as a path of purpose, mercy, and inner peace. The most surprising change, perhaps, was within himself. He no longer felt the need to argue, to be right, or to tear down others. His heart had softened. He had tasted something beautiful, something that didn't need to be shouted from rooftops to be true. It was in the quiet, the kindness, and the consistency. He had mocked Islam with loud words for years, but it was the quiet, consistent beauty of its people that won his heart. As he looked back on his journey, the change felt surreal. He had gone from ridiculing Islam publicly to sitting quietly in a mosque, feeling tears gather in his eyes during the Friday khutbah. The man who once scoffed at prayer now found peace in watching others prostrate before their Creator. The same Quran he once quoted out of context to attack Muslims was now a book he read with awe, underlining verses that spoke directly to his heart. This wasn't just a shift in opinion, It was a transformation of the soul. He returned to the community forum where it all began, the same place where he had once raised his voice to insult, to challenge, to mock. But this time, he didn't come to speak. He came to listen. He spotted the same old man sitting quietly in the front row, just as calm and composed as before. And though months had passed, the memory of that day remained fresh in his heart. After the event ended, he approached the man and gently introduced himself, this time with humility, not hostility. "I want to thank you," he said. "Your silence changed my life." The old man looked at him and smiled once again, this time with recognition and warmth. "Sometimes," the man replied softly, "the heart hears what the ears cannot, and silence can be louder than words." That sentence stayed with him long after the conversation ended. It perfectly described what had happened to him. He hadn't been argued into change. He hadn't been debated into submission. He had been moved by an act of patience, by the grace of character, by the quiet strength of a man who chose not to respond with ego, but with faith. He didn't rush into taking the Shahada. He wanted to be sure, sincere, and fully committed. But in his heart, the door had opened. And where there was once mockery, now there was love. Where there was arrogance, now there was humility. Where there was resistance, now there was longing. Islam wasn't something he had lost an argument to. It was something he had discovered, slowly, through silence and sincerity. The journey wasn't over, but he had taken the most important step. And it all started with one old man's silence. Sometimes the greatest changes in life don't begin with a loud moment, but with silence. In his case, it wasn't a debate or a clever response that shifted his heart. It was the unshakable peace of an old Muslim man who didn't say a single word. That silence carried the weight of wisdom, patience, and truth, something far deeper than argument could ever offer. It forced him to stop, reflect, and look inward for the first time in years. What he found was not weakness in Islam, but a depth of faith and character that he had never witnessed before. This story reminds us all of the power of character, of how our behavior, even in silence, can plant seeds in the hearts of others. The Prophet Muhammad was known not only for what he said, but for how he lived, with mercy, with dignity, and with patience. That old man sitting silently in the face of mockery was following that same prophetic example. And it was that example, not argument, that changed a hardened heart. As the man began to understand Islam for himself, he didn't find the hatred he had once assumed was there. He found a religion built on peace, on compassion, on justice, and above all, on submission to the one true God. He found teachings that honored Jesus, protected the rights of neighbors, lifted the status of women, and commanded believers to speak the truth, even against themselves. And he saw Muslims, real Muslims, who lived their faith not with pride or aggression, but with quiet strength and unwavering sincerity. This journey wasn't just about one man's transformation. It's a reminder to us all. For those who follow Islam, your character may be the most powerful dawah. Your silence, your patience, your kindness, they all matter. And for those who are still searching, wondering, or doubting, sometimes the answers you seek come not from shouting, but from listening. Thank you so much for watching and being part of this powerful story. If it touched your heart, if it made you think differently, then we invite you to keep exploring, keep asking, keep seeking, because the truth is not far, it's closer than you think. May peace be upon you all. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and stay open-hearted.